For 1,000 years, humanity sat at the great table of the Galactic Compact, quiet, measured, and deliberate. They voted for peace. They funded rebuilding efforts. They mediated conflicts between species who had forgotten what they were even fighting about. Other civilizations came and went. Empires burned each other to dust. Ancient species collapsed under the weight of their own wars. Humanity watched all of it from their seat at the table and still sent aid to both sides before the fires cooled. That was what made them so easy to study. They were predictable, consistent. Every alien intelligence agency in the Compact had a file on humanity, and every file said the same thing in different languages. Harmless, compassionate, unlikely to escalate. The Empire had read every one of those files. They read them the way a predator studies the terrain before it strikes, not with respect, but with cold, careful calculation. They were not curious about humanity. They were selecting a target. They were not subtle about what they were. 7 billion warriors, clad in biological armor that had evolved over of internal conflict. There had no word for surrender. Their children learned to fight before they learned to speak. For 3 centuries, they had expanded their territory through a method they called the ordered expansion. Others called it massacre. They would identify a species, assess its military capability, launch a coordinated orbital strike, and move in before the dust settled. They were efficient, they were disciplined, and they were very, very good at choosing the right targets, species with small militaries, species without strong alliances, species that the Compact would mourn briefly and then quietly forget. They had never once chosen a target that fought back hard enough to matter. That was the unspoken rule of the ordered expansion. Strike the weak, spare yourself the cost, move on before anyone organizes a response. When the High Command first reviewed the file on humanity, the meeting lasted less than an hour. The lead strategist commander set the data slate down and said one word: when, not if. When. Earth had no standing war fleet, not officially. The Galactic Compact discouraged it. Humanity had a defense auxiliary, lightly armed patrol vessels designed for search and rescue operations and border monitoring. Nothing that could threaten a battle group. Earth's economy was built on trade and research. Its colonies were agricultural and scientific, spread across 7 systems, rich in resources, lightly defended. On every strategic map in every war room, they glowed like an open door. Spent 3 months finalizing the plan. He was thorough. He accounted for every variable he could measure: response time from the nearest compact peacekeeping fleet, civilian evacuation capacity on each colony, possible diplomatic interference from allied species. He did not account for the one variable that could not be measured, the one that had no entry in any intelligence file, because no alien observer had ever thought to look for it, because it had never once been visible. On a cold Tuesday morning in the year 3142, the colony world of Verity Station woke up to a sunrise it would never finish watching. Its sensors registered the fleet at 6:04 local time. The first orbital strike came at 6:07. 3 minutes, that was all the warning they had. 3 minutes between a normal morning and the end of everything they had ever known. Not enough time to scramble fighters. Not enough time to evacuate. Barely enough time to scream. 6 other colony worlds fell the same morning. Coordinated. Simultaneous. They had timed it so that no colony's distress signal could reach the nearest relay station before the next colony was already burning. It was a masterwork of brutality. By 10:00 Earth Standard Time, 7 colony systems had gone dark. 42 million people. Gone, not captured, not relocated. They did not take prisoners on the first strike. That was policy. That had always been policy. In Earth's administrative district, in a room with no windows and no recording equipment, a communications officer sat alone with a set of headphones and played the last transmission from Verity Station on a loop. It was a child's voice. She was asking for her mother. The officer listened to it 17 times. Then she stood up, removed the headphones, folded them neatly on the desk, and walked out of the room. She did not cry. She did not speak. She walked directly to the War Council chamber and opened the door. The Galactic Compact convened an emergency session at 1400 that afternoon. Representatives from 47 species filled the great circular chamber on Nexus Station. Every seat was occupied. The air carried the particular weight of silence that only exists before something irrevocable is said. Ambassador of the Sovereignty arrived early and took her seat near the front. She had worked beside the human delegation for 11 years. She knew their faces. She had prepared herself to see grief on them, raw, unmistakable grief. She had even prepared what she planned to say. She was not prepared for what she actually saw. The human delegation filed in last, as protocol required. 6 representatives. They moved without urgency, without trembling, without the hollow-eyed devastation had steeled herself to witness. They simply walked in and sat down. They were calm, not the forced calm of people holding themselves together, not the brittle composure of grief sealed behind duty. Something else entirely. Something had never seen on a human face in 11 years of standing beside them. Ambassador Morrow, humanity's lead delegate, placed his data slate on the table with quiet precision. He folded his hands. He looked at the center of the chamber, not at anyone in particular. His expression was completely unreadable. His eyes were clear and still. Leaned toward her aide, a young named, and whispered that something was wrong. Not wrong like grief. Wrong like the feeling before a storm when the air goes still and the birds stop singing and every instinct says to move indoors immediately. Studied the humans for a long moment and said he did not see the problem. They looked composed. Calm, even, turned to face him and said quietly that was precisely the problem. In 11 years, she had never once seen a human look that calm about anything that mattered. 3 other ambassadors noticed it too. The representative, an ancient diplomat named, had spent 4 decades studying Earth's history in his own time. He looked at the human delegation once, stood up slowly, excused himself, and did not return. His aide later said he had gone to send an urgent private transmission home. The session moderator called the chamber to order. The delegation sat in the far arc of the hall as the Compact's charter required. Their lead representative looked completely unbothered. Arms crossed, expression arranged into something very close to a smirk. He had read the files. He knew exactly what humanity would do. They would make a formal statement. They would call for sanctions. They would propose a mediation committee. They would weep on record and then negotiate quietly behind closed doors. That was what harmless species did. That was the pattern. The moderator opened the floor. By protocol, the aggrieved party spoke first. Every eye in the chamber turned to the human delegation. Morrow stood slowly. He adjusted the front of his jacket. He looked at the room, really looked at it, moving his gaze from face to face, species to species, unhurried. Then he sat back down. He said nothing, not one word. He looked at the room and he sat down and he folded his hands on the table again and he simply waited, as if the session were already over, as if he had already seen how it was going to end. The chamber erupted, 47 species talking at once. The moderator called for order 3 times before the noise faded, had uncrossed his arms. He was no longer smirking. His eyes were fixed on Morrow with an expression that had no clean translation in the language. Gripped the edge of her data slate so tightly her knuckles shifted color. She had been a diplomat for 30 years. She had watched empires fall across negotiating tables exactly like this one. She had seen declarations of war delivered with more gentleness than what she was feeling right now. It was not fear exactly. It was the sensation of standing at the edge of something enormous and not being able to see the bottom. The quiet, terrible understanding that something had just begun and that it had no name yet in any language, in any species' vocabulary. Morrow looked at across the width of the chamber. He held the representative's gaze for 7 full seconds. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was something older than a smile, something that had nothing at all to do with warmth. Looked away first. He turned back to his aides and said something in low, clipped that the translation systems barely caught. What they did catch was this: run the withdrawal protocols quietly, tonight. His aide stared at him, repeated the order without blinking. In the outer corridor of Nexus Station, a communications officer named was reviewing the afternoon's transmissions when his scanner flagged something unusual. A signal, human origin, encrypted beyond anything in the bouncing through 17 relay points before arriving. He filed an immediate report. His superior reviewed the flag and marked it low priority. Signal irregularities happened on Nexus all the time. He noted it for morning follow-up and moved on. There would not be a morning follow-up. There would not be many next mornings for a great number of things. The session ended without a resolution, without a statement, without the formal protest every species in the room had been expecting. Delegates left in quiet clusters, speaking in low voices, not quite willing to say aloud what several of them had privately started to believe. Was the last one out? She stopped in the doorway and looked back at the human delegation table one final time. It was empty now. The data slate Morrow had placed so carefully in front of him was still sitting there. She crossed back to it and looked at the screen. It was completely blank. No prepared remarks, no diplomatic framework, no notes, nothing. She stood there for a long moment, then set it back down exactly as he had left it. When she straightened, she realized her hands were not quite steady. She stepped into the corridor and found waiting. He asked what she thought was going to happen next. Was quiet for a long time, longer than he expected. Then she said she did not know, but she said it the way someone says it when they are not sure they want to find out. That night, aboard the command vessel docked in Nexus Station's outer ring, sat alone reviewing his projections for the fourth time. All the variables were accounted for. Response timelines, diplomatic fallout, economic disruption. Every model, every dataset, every historical parallel pointed to the same conclusion. Humanity would protest. Humanity would grieve. Humanity would eventually negotiate. Every piece of data said so. Every century of recorded behavior confirmed it. He had built the entire operation on that foundation. He sat in the dark and told himself the foundation was solid. He told himself that until he fell asleep. And somewhere down the long corridor, in a room no one had entered since the delegation left, a blank data slate sat on a table in the dark and quietly held the only answer that mattered. If humanity came to that chamber with nothing to say, no statement, no demands, no tears, then there were only two possible explanations. Either they had already given up, or they had already decided. And if they had already decided, then words were never going to be part of what came next. Somewhere in the deep dark between star systems, a signal was traveling, moving faster than long-range scanners could track, bouncing through 17 encrypted relay points toward a destination with no registered coordinates in any public compact database. No one on Nexus Station knew what it contained. The response came back in less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes from a destination so remote that light alone would have needed hours to cross that distance. Whatever was waiting at the other end of that signal was not where any map said it should be. It was already much, much closer. The silence was not what the galaxy expected. It was not the silence of grief. It was not the silence of a species retreating into mourning. It was something else entirely, clean and cold and deliberate as a blade being sharpened in the dark. For 6 full days after the massacre, humanity issued no statement, no formal protest, no request for emergency arbitration. The taunting, calling the 7 colonies, a necessary message to the Compact, received no reply at all. The Compact's intelligence networks worked around the clock trying to interpret the silence. Their analysts produced 17 separate reports. 11 concluded humanity was in shock. 4 suggested internal political paralysis. 2 simply said, "We don't know." The 2 honest reports were filed away and largely ignored. The Compact preferred explanations that fit the narrative they already believed. Humanity was gentle. Humanity was grieving. Humanity would come to the table when it was ready. Read every report from his desk on the command vessel. He had positioned the ship near the Compact's outer relay stations to monitor the diplomatic situation in person. Every morning, he reviewed the data. Every morning, his projections held steady. On the 4th day, he noticed something small, a micro-fluctuation in humanity's deep space relay network. Nothing alarming on its own. Signal traffic reorganizing, possibly. He noted it and moved on. On the fifth day, he noticed it again, larger this time. He told himself it was routine maintenance. Network upgrades, possibly. He had built his entire strategy on the certainty that humanity had no capacity for large-scale covert coordination. He was not prepared to question that certainty. Not yet. On the morning of the seventh day, every human diplomatic vessel in every corner of the galaxy powered up its engines simultaneously. No advance notice. No explanation filed with the Compact's transit authority. They simply left, all of them, at the same exact moment. The Compact's transit authority flagged the event as anomalous and sent an automated inquiry to the human embassy network. The inquiry bounced back undelivered. Every human embassy address had been quietly deactivated 12 hours earlier. No one had noticed until now. Ambassador received the transit authority's report at her desk and sat very still for a long time. She had spent 6 days telling herself the silence was grief. She had spent 6 days believing it. She did not believe it anymore. She pulled up the departure logs and ran the timestamp comparison herself. 114 human diplomatic vessels. 114 separate star systems. All engines online within a 4-second window of each other. 4 seconds. Across the entire galaxy. She called for. When he arrived, she turned her screen toward him and asked how long it would take to coordinate that kind of simultaneous departure across that distance. Stared at the numbers for a very long time. Then he said nothing at all. 2 days later, the border sensor stations along the frontier began logging readings their operators refused at first to believe. Massive energy signatures. Not at the border, not near it. Deep inside space, in sectors that had been empty for centuries. Senior sensor operator reviewed the readings 3 times before reporting them. The signatures were too large, too stable. The thermal decay patterns suggested these structures had been generating power for decades, possibly far longer. He filed the report as a possible equipment malfunction. His supervisor ran a full diagnostic on every sensor array in the sector. All systems returned green. The readings were accurate. Whatever was out there had been sitting in the dark for a very long time, silent and cold and waiting, and now, without warning, it had turned on. The mobilized a reconnaissance wing, 12 fast attack vessels under Commander Oran, and sent them in to investigate. Standard protocol. A precaution. No one in high command expected them to find anything that would require a second thought. Oran's squadron dropped out of FTL at the edge of Sector 7 Gamma at 3:40 ship time. For 11 full seconds, every crew member on every vessel sat in complete silence. Then Oran opened the fleet channel and said 2 words very quietly. All stop. The structure in front of them had no name in the language, no entry in any military database, no parallel in anything that had ever built, conquered, or studied. It was the size of a small moon, and there were 17 of them. They were dark, no running lights, no hull markings, just vast, curved surfaces of a material that did not reflect scanner light the way metal should. They sat in perfect geometric formation, equidistant, silent, still, like something that had been arranged with a great deal of patience. Oran transmitted a full sensor sweep to High Command before she did anything else. She did not order her squadron closer. She did not attempt contact. She held position and reported because the part of her shaped by decades of combat was telling her something that had no tactical name yet. High Command received the report and immediately ordered a full military alert across the frontier. They ran targeting simulations on the structures. They calculated optimal approach vectors. They were thorough and disciplined because that was what they were. They never got to act on any of it. Because exactly 11 minutes after Oran's report arrived at High Command, 11 minutes, as if someone had been counting, 3 of the largest deep space supply depots simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, that word was too simple, too familiar. Destroyed meant debris. It meant wreckage and fire and the slow cooling of ruined metal. What happened to those 3 depots left nothing behind. No debris field, no radiation signature, no trace of any kind. They were there, and then they were not, as if the universe had decided they had never existed. 3 installations, 40,000 personnel, 180 years of accumulated military infrastructure, gone in less time than it takes to blink. Sensor records showed a single pulse from the nearest cathedral platform, a focused beam of something the instruments could measure but could not categorize. It lasted 0.3 seconds. It traveled at a velocity that should not have been physically possible. Received the incident report and did something no one had ever seen him do in 30 years of command. He sat down on the floor, not in his chair, on the floor. He held the data slate in both hands and sat there in complete silence. His aide, a young logistics officer named, stood in the doorway and did not know what to do. He had served under for 4 years. He had watched his commander navigate catastrophic tactical situations with perfect composure. He had never seen anything like this. Eventually stood up. He straightened his uniform. He told to prepare a full incident briefing for high command and to use the phrase critical strategic miscalculation in the subject line. Began typing. His hands were shaking and he did not try to hide it. The Emergency War Council convened on the 12 hours later. The chamber was built for 70. It held 41. 9 seats were empty, the commanders who had been stationed at the 3 supply depots that no longer existed. General stood at the head of the chamber. He was the oldest active commander in the military, 83 years in service, 14 campaigns, 0 defeats. His face was a landscape of old scars and older choices. He spoke without notes and without pausing. He said the structures humanity had deployed were not, in his assessment, weapons platforms. Too large, too few for a standard offensive posture. They were a demonstration, a message delivered in the only language they had ever truly respected: pure, absolute power. He said the 3 depots had not been chosen at random. They had been selected because their destruction caused maximum logistical disruption with minimum visible aggression. Whoever had chosen those targets understood military infrastructure better than most generals currently in that room. He paused. The chamber held its breath. 40 sets of eyes waited, looked at the center of the room, not at any individual, just at the air, and said the 6 words that no one present had ever expected to hear from his mouth. "We may have made an error." 6 words, spoken in a language with no word for surrender by a general who had never in 83 years used the word retreat. The chamber did not erupt. It went quieter. Somehow that was far worse. 3 council members immediately called for an aggressive counterstrike. 2 requested an emergency diplomatic channel to the compact. 1 simply walked to the chamber window and stared out at the sky without speaking. Let all of them finish. Then he said, "Look at what they erased." Not what they destroyed, what they erased. They did not want us to have debris. They did not want us to have wreckage. They wanted us to have nothing, not even the comfort of knowing what used to be there. Think about what kind of mind plans for that. The 3 members who had been loudest about the counterstrike sat back down slowly. One of them, a colonel named who had personally overseen 2 ordered expansions, lifted his water vessel and drank from it. His hand was not steady. He set it down carefully and said nothing more. Across the galaxy, the story was breaking through the Compact's public networks. Not the full story that had sealed the censor records. But rumors in the Compact traveled faster than classified orders, and the shape of what was happening was becoming visible between the lines. In the archive district of the home station, a historian named Myra Sen had been working through the night. She had not been assigned to this research. She had started it herself 6 days ago on instinct, the moment she heard the news of the 7 colonies going dark. She was 60 years old and had spent her career pre-compact civilizations. She specialized in the period before the Great Reconciliation, the 1,000 years of galactic history that most species had quietly agreed not to discuss too openly in polite company. She had found something, not in the public archives, in the restricted pre-compact records that required her highest academic clearance to access, records so old that 3 of the languages they were written in had not been spoken anywhere in the galaxy for 8 centuries. The records described an ancient conflict, predating humanity's membership in the Compact by 400 years. A war between early human colony ships and a now-extinct civilization called the Dominion. The had attacked first. They had been numerous, confident, and well-armed. The war lasted 19 months. At the end of it, the Dominion had ceased to exist. Not conquered, not occupied, ceased. Their worlds were untouched. Humanity had not wanted the planets. They had only wanted the threat removed. It had been removed permanently and completely. Myra Sen sat back from her desk and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she kept searching, because if there was one record like this, there would be others. She found 3 more before sunrise, then 5 more after that. Then she stopped counting. Every record described the same pattern. A species attacked humanity. Humanity went quiet. Then humanity responded not with proportional force, not with retaliation scaled to the offense, but with total, surgical, permanent resolution. Then humanity went quiet again, as if nothing had happened. The Compact had been founded on mutual protection and shared peace. Humanity had been one of its founding members. They had sat at that table for 1,000 years, voting, mediating, funding, building, and they had never once raised their voice. What the records suggested, what Myra Sen was now sitting with alone in her archive at 4:00 in the morning, was that the Compact had not made humanity peaceful. Humanity had chosen peace. The way someone chooses to set down a weapon they are still entirely capable of using. She filed her preliminary findings with the senior counsel at dawn. She marked the report urgent. She marked it classified. Then she pressed both hands flat on her desk and breathed carefully because she did not want to follow the thought to its natural conclusion. She followed it anyway. Every species that had been in that compact chamber when Morrow sat down without saying a word. Every ambassador who had watched him look at with that cold, ancient expression that was not quite a smile. They had all been in the same room. They had all watched humanity choose not to speak but to act. And they had now watched the first action land. 3 depots, gone, perfectly chosen, precisely executed. 11 minutes after the warning was received, as if every second of that timeline had been calculated long in advance. It had been, Myra Sen understood that now. The cathedral platforms had not been activated in response to the massacre. They had been activated on a schedule, one set long before the struck. Perhaps years before, perhaps decades. The massacre had not triggered the plan, it had simply started the clock. Which meant humanity had not built those platforms as a reaction. They had built them as a preparation. For 1,000 years, they had sat at peace summits and mediated border disputes and funded reconstruction projects. And they had also, quietly, been getting ready. And they had handed them the justification, freely and confidently, based on intelligence files compiled over an entire century. Files that had studied humanity from every angle and reached the same conclusion each time. One word, at the top of every single report: harmless. In deep space, beyond the outermost edge of territory, a single human vessel sat in the dark. Not a cathedral platform, not a siege engine. A small, unmarked courier ship with a crew of 7 and no weapons of any kind registered in any galactic database. Its pilot, a woman named, was finishing a cold meal at her console and watching the sensor returns from the frontier with the easy attention of someone who had been expecting exactly what they were seeing. She had been parked in that position for 11 months. When the depot readings confirmed, she set down her fork, picked up the narrowband transmitter beside her console, and sent a burst message on a frequency so obscure it had not appeared in any in recorded history. Then she picked her fork back up and kept eating. A response came back in under a minute. 4 words. Read them once, nodded once, and began calculating a new heading. She did not look worried. She did not look excited. She looked like someone who had simply reached the next item on a very long, very carefully written list. No one in the galaxy knew her name. No one knew the courier ship existed. No one, not the High Command, not the Galactic Compact, not the ambassadors filing panicked, encrypted reports in the dark, knew what those 4 words said. But in 72 hours, one species was going to find out exactly what they meant. And it was not the species anyone in the galaxy was currently watching. The collective had stood beside humanity for 200 years. Not in the polite, transactional way most compact members stood beside each other, but genuinely in ways that left real marks on both civilizations. They had co-authored 43 scientific breakthroughs. They had shared contested border systems without a single arbitration dispute for over a century. When Verity Station burned, the ambassador had been the first non-human to send a private message to Earth's council. No cameras, no press release, just words. That was why humanity trusted them, not because of treaties or trade agreements or formal declarations of partnership, because of that private message, because of 200 years of small, quiet moments that meant more than any ceremony ever could. When the War Council coordinated with the Compact's inner circle, humanity's lead strategist, Commander, presented the Third Deep Fleet's operational plan in full. No redactions, no details, because every person in that room had earned the trust it took to be there. The representatives listened. They nodded. They asked careful questions and received careful answers. When the session ended, their senior delegate, a diplomat named, shook Commander's hand and said humanity's restraint in the face of such provocation was remarkable. Thanked him. 31 hours later, was in a private secure channel with the intelligence handler he had been communicating with for the past 11 years. He transmitted the full operational plan without a single omission. Then he closed the channel and sat in the dark of his office for a very long time. He had not done it for money. He had not done it for ideology. He had done it because he was afraid. Not of they were a known quantity, a predictable threat. He was afraid of humanity, of what the cathedral platforms truly meant, of what humanity was clearly becoming again. He had told himself he was protecting the galaxy, that stopping humanity's momentum before it became something truly unstoppable was the rational choice. He still believed it. Sitting in the dark, trying not to think about how many names he had just handed over, he still believed it. The Third Deep Fleet dropped from FTL at 2:17 ship time, 8 hours after the plan was transmitted. Admiral Sierra Vance commanded from the bridge of the unbroken Meridian. She was 51 years old, 30 years in service. She had never once lost a ship. The ambush was already waiting. They had not simply read the plan, they had refined it. They had positioned 109 warships in a configuration that covered every calculated exit vector the human fleet had planned to use. Every single one. Vance recognized it in the first 3 seconds. Not because she had seen this exact formation before, because she had designed the exit vectors herself. And if someone had built a formation specifically to block all of them, then someone had read the plan. She did not waste time processing the betrayal. There was no space for it. The first salvo was already moving, and she had a fleet to save. She opened the broadband command channel, and her voice was completely level when she spoke. All captains, this is an ambush. Exit vectors are fully compromised. Scatter protocol effective immediately, maximum speed, randomized headings, do not wait for formation. Get your crews out. That is a direct order. Move now. She closed the channel. She looked at her helmsman, a young lieutenant named 18 months aboard the Meridian, and told him to calculate the precise center point of the formation. He asked for confirmation. She told him she did not need to confirm it. The unbroken Meridian turned into the formation like a blade finding the space between ribs. Not recklessly, precisely. Vance was not throwing her ship into the fire. She was placing it, with the calm deliberation of someone who had already done the math and accepted the answer it gave her. She bought her surviving captains 4 minutes and 22 seconds. That was the interval between the Meridian's entry into the formation and the moment the guns finally found enough angles on the hull to end it. 4 minutes and 22 seconds of borrowed time. In those 4 minutes and 22 seconds, the unbroken Meridian destroyed 37 warships. Not disabled, destroyed. Her shields were offline, dropped to redirect maximum power to weapons output. She traded every layer of armor for firepower. She made the trade count. Captain of the destroyer Resolute Standard received the scatter order and obeyed. He pushed his drives to maximum output and did not look back, because Admiral Vance had told him not to, and because he was a good officer who followed orders even when following them cost something irreplaceable. He watched the meridian on his rear scanners for 3 seconds before he forced himself to look forward. He would spend the rest of his life wishing he had not looked at all, and with equal force, he would spend the rest of his life wishing he had looked longer. The last transmission from the unbroken meridian reached 11 surviving vessels of the Third Deep Fleet as they scattered into the dark. It was not a farewell. It was not a final speech. It was a single navigational waypoint, coordinates, and a timestamp. The coordinates marked a rendezvous point deep in neutral space. The timestamp was 48 hours from the moment of transmission. Vance had planned for her fleet to survive. She had set the meeting point before the battle began. She had always known she would not be at it. 11 ships made the rendezvous. Of the 41,312 human personnel who had jumped with the Third Deep Fleet, 4,219 survived. The rest were simply gone. No wreckage recovered. No remains, just an absence where people had been. Presided over the rendezvous by rank, he was the senior surviving officer. He delivered the full damage report to 11 command crews on an encrypted channel in a flat, precise voice. He did not pause. He did not waver. He had learned that from Admiral Vance. He intended to keep it. When the report ended, he closed the channel, went to his private quarters, and stayed there for 2 hours. No one disturbed him. When he came out, his face was composed, his uniform was crisp, and he had a new order drafted for the surviving fleet. The order was to make best speed for human-controlled space. It included a secondary instruction that appeared in no standard military protocol manual. 7 words, nothing more. Remember every name. No elaboration, no explanation, just that. 7 words placed beneath the rest like a foundation. The news reached Earth 6 hours after the battle. In the room with no windows, the same communications officer who had listened to the child's voice on a loop sat at the same desk and received the full casualty report. She read it once. She folded it. She stood. She crossed to a cabinet on the far wall, not a terminal, not a data system, but a physical cabinet with a physical lock, and removed a physical ledger, real paper. The kind that could not be hacked, could not be intercepted, could not be erased by any system ever built. She turned to a page near the back. There were names already there, not many, but they existed, written in precise, unhurried handwriting, each with a notation beside it. She found the blank line below the last entry. She uncapped a pen. She wrote one name. Ambassador, that was the name. Then in the notation column beside it, she wrote 2 words in a script so old that fewer than 3 people in the entire human government still knew how to read it. No mercy. She closed the ledger. She locked the cabinet. She returned to her desk and made no calls and filed no reports because the ledger was not a legal document. It held no official status in any government system. It was something older than systems, something older than governments entirely. Morrow received the casualty report in his private office on Earth's administrative ring. He read it standing because he had been standing when the alert came through and he never sat down. He read it twice. Then he placed the data slate face down on his desk. He walked to the window and looked down at the city. It was early morning. The streets below were beginning to fill, ordinary people, starting ordinary days, with no idea what had just happened in the dark between distant stars. He watched them for a long time. Then he turned from the window and made 3 calls. None of them were to diplomats. None were to compact representatives or allied ambassadors or any of the people he had spent 2 decades building careful, principled relationships with. The calls went to 3 individuals whose names did not appear in any public directory. People with no official title. People who had never attended a summit, signed a treaty, or appeared in any record that could be accessed outside a single specific room. When the 3rd call ended, Morrow sat down at last. He drew the data slate back toward him and looked at the casualty numbers one final time. 41,000 names. He held them in his mind for a long moment. Then he opened a new document and began to type. He typed for 9 minutes. The document was 3 lines long. That was all it needed to be. He sent it to 4 recipients, deleted the sent record, closed the application, and sat quietly with the weight of what he had just set in motion. Within 20 minutes, every human treaty still active in the Galactic Compact was suspended. Not terminated, suspended, with no reinstatement timeline attached. Every diplomatic channel between humanity and every other species went completely, absolutely silent. Every human trade vessel in every compact port filed simultaneous emergency departure notices. Every human research team on every non-human station received the same 2-word encrypted signal. They packed their equipment and left. All of them, within hours, without a single public statement. The compact woke the next morning to discover that humanity had, overnight, quietly retracted from every shared space it had occupied for a century. Not violently, not with a declaration, just gone. The way water pulls back from a shoreline before something enormous arrives. Ambassador stood on Nexus Station's observation deck and looked at the empty human embassy suite across the ring. She stood there for a long time and felt something move in her chest that had no precise name. Not fear, not grief exactly, something beneath both of them and between them. Ambassador received the news of the treaty suspensions at 7:00 that morning. He was still in his office, still in the same chair, same dark. He had not slept and had not moved, and he looked like a man who had made a careful calculation and was now living inside its result. His aide told him the human embassy suite was empty, nodded once. His aide told him 3 separate species had filed emergency requests to move their embassies away from Earth's orbital ring. Nodded again. His aide asked what they should do, looked at the wall and said nothing. The 3 species that had filed relocation requests, and the quietly reclusive, had each submitted their requests independently, within hours of each other, without any coordination between them. They had all reached the same conclusion at precisely the same moment. Distance was the only reasonable response. The Compact's administrative board processed all 3 requests in under an hour. That was unprecedented. Requests of that kind required a standard 30-day review cycle. The board waived it unanimously and without discussion. Speed felt important when the thing you were moving away from was humanity. In the War Council chamber, General received the ambush report alone. He read through the 3rd Deep Fleet casualty figures in silence. Then he kept reading, past the victory summary, past the tactical assessment, until he reached the section about the unbroken Meridian. 37 warships, destroyed by a single human vessel with no shields, in 4 minutes and 22 seconds, while the rest of the fleet scattered, while its own admiral was already dead. He set the report flat on the table and stared at the wall across from him. His aide colonel asked how the engagement should be classified in the official military record. A victory, presumably, the human fleet had been eliminated. Looked at him slowly and said, "Do not call it a victory, write down what it cost us, all of it, every number." Began to object, the fleet had been destroyed. The numbers clearly supported a victory classification, silenced him with a look. Then he said, 41,000 humans entered that ambush, and the last thing they did was kill 37 of ours. Do not call it a victory. The chamber held a silence that no one moved to fill, because what was saying beneath those words, what every officer in that room understood, regardless of whether they wanted to, was that the math had always been wrong. And now they had proof they could not dispute. In deep space, the 11 surviving ships of the 3rd Deep Fleet moved at maximum drive toward human-controlled territory. Sat at his console and looked at the rendezvous coordinates Vance had sent in her final transmission, and he thought about what it meant that she had already written them before the battle. She had known, not the specifics, she could not have known those, but she had known something was wrong before the jump. She had prepared the meeting point before the fleet left port. She had given her people a way home before she decided she would not be taking it. He had served under her for 6 years. He had never once seen her wrong about that deep instinct, the thing that lived beneath tactics and strategy, the thing that could not be explained in any briefing room. He had trusted it completely. He had trusted her. He opened the fleet-wide channel and addressed 4,219 surviving personnel. He told them what had happened, not a summary, not a sanitized briefing. The full account. Every detail, every name lost, every second of the engagement. No softening of any kind. Because Admiral Vance had always believed that the worst thing you could do to the dead was make their absence easy to absorb. So made it hard. He made every survivor carry the full weight of it, because that was the only honest thing left to do in her memory. When he finished, the channel stayed silent for a long time. Then one by one the surviving captains opened their own channels, not to speak, just to open them, to confirm they were present, still there, still in it. Counted 11 open channels. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them, turned to his navigator, and gave the order for best speed home. Vance had told him to scatter and survive. He had survived. The rest of what needed doing would not wait. Back on Earth, in the room with no windows, the ledger sat locked in its cabinet, and the name on the last line rested in the dark beside 2 words that had not been written in that book in 400 years. No mercy, not a declaration, not a slogan, a designation, a classification of response with no diplomatic equivalent, no legal ceiling, no negotiated limit. The oldest notation in human military history. Written only 3 times in 4 centuries before tonight. Each of those 3 previous entries had been written about a species that no longer existed anywhere in the galaxy. That was not a coincidence. It was a pattern. And in the quiet dark of a room no public record acknowledged, the 4th entry was still fresh on the page, and the pattern had just begun to move. Day 14 arrived without ceremony. No announcement. No declaration. Just a shift in deep space sensor readings that monitoring stations logged at 6:00 standard time, and could not explain for the 11 minutes that followed. In those 11 minutes, 47 human vessels moved into position across 7 separate sectors of space. They did not fire. They did not communicate. They simply stopped, held formation, and did something that no weapon system in any compact database had a classification for. They reached into the physics of the space around them and pulled. Not metaphorically. The Shepard-class vessels carried technology so far beyond any known platform that the best scientists spent 3 days arguing whether the sensor readings were even real. They were real. Each Shepard vessel had locked onto the gravitational resonance of the nearest star system and was feeding it back, amplified, focused, directed, turning the fundamental force that held solar systems together into a precision instrument of total war. The first shipyard to feel it simply came apart. No explosion, no fire, just catastrophic structural failure as the gravitational gradient beneath its foundations shifted by 3 decimal points in the wrong direction. It folded like paper inside a closing fist. On the ground, the recovered divisions arrived without warning, the way shadows arrive. Gradually and then all at once. They made no announcements. They broadcast no demands. The first sign that they had entered an installation was when the installation simply stopped responding. They moved in complete silence, sharing every data point across a real-time network that turned 40 soldiers into one distributed, furious mind. One unit saw an obstacle. All units adjusted instantly. No orders, no lag, no hesitation of any kind whatsoever. A garrison commander named veteran of 11 ground campaigns watched them on his security feeds for the 3 minutes before his feed cut out. He later said in his tribunal deposition that they moved the way mathematics moves. Inevitable, frictionless, already finished. On day 19, with 17 installations disabled and 4 more going dark by the hour, Supreme Commander Shan sat alone in his private chamber and wrote a personal message to Earth's War Council. He had commanded armies for 60 years. He wrote 3 drafts. He destroyed the first 2. The 3rd draft was 4 sentences long. He identified himself. He acknowledged the full scale of what humanity had demonstrated. He noted that further resistance would result in disproportionate civilian casualties on the... Then he asked for terms. Earth's War Council received the message at 14:22. They reviewed it for 9 minutes. Then Morrow sent the reply personally, from the same desk where he had read the 3rd Deep Fleet's casualty numbers. The reply was 4 words. It is too late. Not a threat, not a negotiating position. A plain statement of fact delivered in the quiet, unhurried tone used to inform someone that the ship has already sailed. Clean, final, offering nothing. Shan read it 4 times. Then he stood and crossed to the window of his private chamber and looked out at his sky. He had defended that sky for 60 years. He stood at that window and understood, without any doubt, that it would not look the same after today. On day 22, the went dark. Not partially, not gradually. Every communication satellite in their orbital network stopped transmitting simultaneously at precisely 2:00 local time, in a sequence designed to cause maximum disruption with minimum hardware damage. Every screen on the activated at the same moment. Every public terminal, every home display, every government broadcast system. White background, black text, 6 words. Wait your turn. Nothing else, no sender, no timestamp, just those 6 words burning on every surface. Ambassador saw it from his office window. Every screen in the skyline below lit up at the same instant with the same message. He did not reach for his communicator. He did not call his aide. He stood at the glass and read it and did not look away for a long time. The government convened an emergency session within the hour. They drafted a formal statement. They attempted to broadcast it. The broadcast went nowhere because there was nothing left to broadcast on. Humanity had not destroyed their infrastructure. They had simply switched it off. That distinction carried more weight than it seemed. Destroyed infrastructure was a wound. Disabled infrastructure was something else, a hand resting on a shoulder, calm and firm, saying, "We chose to stop here. We are choosing when." The government understood. So did every citizen who read those 6 words. On day 27, the High Command building lost power at 3:00. Emergency systems failed to engage. The entire structure sat in darkness for 41 minutes, the exact number of minutes it had taken the 3rd Deep Fleet to die in the ambush. Then the lights returned. Every security camera was intact. Every recording system was running. Every sensor was fully operational, but every seat at the High Command table was empty. No commanders remained, no sign of struggle, no trace of how it had happened, no explanation that any known technology could provide. At the exact center of the table, placed with geometric precision, equidistant from every edge, sat a human flag, folded into a tight, formal rectangle. The funeral fold. The kind used when a flag is returned to a family in place of the person it once represented. The galaxy watched the footage on every public channel within 6 hours. Analysts debated. Historians cross-referenced. Compact representatives issued measured statements. Not one of them fully understood what they were looking at. But every human who saw that footage understood it immediately and completely. It was not a trophy. It was not a declaration of victory. It was a receipt, rendered in the oldest military language humanity possessed, paid in full for 41,000 names that had never come home. The War Council had not sent a message. They had closed an account. General watched the footage alone in his quarters. He watched it twice without expression. Then he opened a drawer, removed a sheet of paper, and wrote something by hand. He sealed it and left instructions that it not be opened until the war was formally concluded. It would remain sealed for 11 years. When the Compact Tribunal finally unsealed it, every species in the gallery quoted the same single line. The last line had written, beneath his signature. In the quiet of his room on the night, the lights came back in an empty building. We studied every war they ever fought, every campaign. We saw the pattern and called it savagery. We never understood that what we were reading every time across every century was a species choosing restraint. And somewhere in deep space, on a heading no public chart recorded, Shan's personal vessel was moving not toward the and not away from humanity, toward something else entirely, something that had not happened in 400 years of galactic history, something no one was expecting him to do. Day 30 arrived in silence, not the silence of shock, not the silence of grief, something different. Something earned. The kind of silence that settles over a room when something vast and long anticipated has finally, completely, and irrevocably come to rest. At 6:07 Earth Standard Time, the exact minute, 30 days earlier, when the first orbital strike had fallen on Verity Station. The Empire's senior remaining official pressed his seal to the unconditional cessation document and did not lift his eyes from the table. There had been no negotiations. Humanity had offered none. The cessation had been drafted in full before the conflict began, every clause, every binding condition, every line of consequence prepared and finalized long before the first Shepherd vessel had moved into position. The official who signed it, a career bureaucrat named who had never held a weapon in his life, did not read the full text. He already understood that the answers to any questions he might ask would not bring him any comfort. He signed where he was told to sign. That was all. The Galactic Compact convened its emergency session 2 hours later. The chamber that had erupted in chaos on that first terrible afternoon, 47 species speaking at once, the air crackling with confusion, was completely, perfectly silent before the session even formally opened. The delegates filed in and took their seats without a word. No side conversations. No nervous energy exchanged across the aisle. Every chair filled. Then the chamber doors opened for the human delegation, and something happened that had never once appeared in the Compact's procedural record in 1,000 years of operation. Every delegate stood, every species, every ambassador, aide, and in the gallery above. They rose without instruction, without signal, without precedent, not from protocol, not from procedure, from something far older than either and far more honest than both. Morrow walked to the delegation table and paused before sitting. He looked at the room the way he had on that first terrible afternoon, slowly, taking in every face, every species. Then he sat, folded his hands on the table, and said nothing. There was nothing left that required words. The ambassador from the sovereignty, an ancient diplomat named, whose own civilization's history contained 32 failed wars of conquest, leaned toward her aide as the chamber settled. She spoke just loud enough to reach the 3 nearest delegates. "They were never the gentle ones," she said quietly. "We were wrong about that from the very beginning. They were the patient ones. There is a difference. We should have understood that difference a very long time ago." Ambassador heard those words from across the aisle. She closed her eyes for exactly one breath. She had spent 30 days trying to find the right words for what she had witnessed, had found them in 2 sentences, did not try to improve on them. The memorial on Verity Station was completed on day 33. The colony was rebuilt from its ash and foundations by deliberate choice, new structures on the same ground. The memorial stood at the center of the rebuilt settlement, in the exact square where the first strike had landed 33 days before. Carved into its surface were 41,312 names. Every soldier lost in the ambush of the Third Deep Fleet. Every colonist from Verity Station and the 6 other worlds. Every name that had ever been spoken once in a room with no windows by a child looking for her mother. Admiral Sierra Vance's name stood first, carved at the very top in slightly larger letters, not because any design specification required it, but because every worker on the construction team had independently suggested it. Not one person had disagreed. Not one. Captain attended the dedication in full dress uniform. He read every name within his line of sight. He had already memorized every name from the ambush, every single one beginning the night of the rendezvous. He had not stopped adding to that list since. When the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, stayed. He stood alone in the square while the light changed around him. Then he placed his palm flat against the stone, held it there for 3 full seconds, and turned and walked away without looking back. He had learned that from Vance. You look forward, you carry the weight. You do not stop moving because stopping is the one thing the dead cannot afford for you to do on their behalf. So he did not stop. The collective entered formal diplomatic isolation on day 31. No trade, no communication channels, no compact representation. Every species that had maintained ties with received the same quiet advisory from humanity. This decision is not yours to contest. Not one species contested it. That, perhaps, was the clearest measure of how completely the galaxy had recalibrated. Not that they feared humanity's anger, but that they genuinely believed humanity had already arrived at the correct and final answer, and that no argument would change it. Ambassador spent the isolation years in a small private residence on the. He resigned the morning after the blackout. He tended a modest garden. He gave no interviews. In the third year, a journalist found his address and asked him one question: did he regret it? Looked at his garden for a long moment. Then he said, "I believed I was preventing something. I was accelerating it." He went inside and closed the door gently, and the journalist stood on the step for a long time before she finally wrote anything down. The collective was to the Galactic Compact after 7 years. The terms were written entirely by humanity. The document was 46 pages. The government signed it without a single revision, a single question, or a single request for clarification. Myra Sen completed her manuscript the morning after the signing. She had spent 7 years building the most complete historical account of the 30-day reckoning ever compiled. She looked at her final sentence for a long time before she closed the file. It read, "In the end, it was not the weapons or the platforms the galaxy could not understand. It was the patience, the 1,000 years of choosing every single day to be something less than what they were." In the room with no windows, the communications officer removed the ledger from its cabinet for the last time. She did not open it. She wrapped it, sealed it, and placed it beside the 3 previous ledgers in the lockbox that would pass to her successor. Then she wrote one line in the plain transition log: "The account is current. Nothing is forgotten." The galaxy spent the next 1,000 years writing about those 30 days. They studied the reckoning in academies, debated it in war colleges, and whispered about it across 100 worlds. But every account, regardless of species, language, or how long the writer spent hopping to reach a different conclusion, ended the same way. Humanity had always been the most dangerous civilization in the galaxy. Not the oldest, not the largest, not the most complex by any standard measurement, simply the most dangerous. And for 1,000 years, they had chosen, every morning at every summit table in every mediation session, not to be. They had sat at the great table and voted and built and smiled, and none of it had made them less of what they were beneath. It had only made them patient. And when the burned 7 worlds and called it a necessary message, they had not awakened something sleeping. They had given something wide awake a reason to stop pretending. If you want to know what came next, what happened when 3 other empires began asking themselves whether they had been making the same mistake as the Stay Close? Because that story is already in motion. It begins on day 31. A ship arrives at Earth's orbital gate with no flight plan, no diplomatic clearance, and no advance communication. A vessel, 1 occupant, the man who had asked for terms 30 days ago and been told it was too late. Shan had not come to surrender. He had not come to negotiate. He had come because whatever had driven the toward humanity, whatever pressure, whatever fear, whatever threat they had been running from when they launched the ordered expansion, was still out there. And it was far larger than humanity had been told. He sat in a holding room on Earth's orbital station and waited. He had not slept in 40 hours. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man who had finally arrived at the only place in the galaxy where what he knew might still be enough to matter.